As we've been discussing for the past few weeks, Jesus' teaching on end-time events, what we call the Olivet Discourse, and it's called the Olivet Discourse because that's where Jesus gave the teaching. It was on the Mount of Olives. As they left on Tuesday, on the week before of Sabbath, and he'd been arguing, basically. He wasn't arguing. The Pharisees and the scribes were arguing with him. He was just telling them the truth. They just wouldn't listen. And as he had warned them just about their hearts and what it meant to be a part of the kingdom, as we've been saying, at some point in time, one of the disciples spoke up about the beauty of the temple. And at some point in the journey, as they were making their way up to the Mount of Olives to Bethany, where they had been staying the night, that Jesus told them that the temple and the city would be destroyed. And this caused them to ask specifically when these things would come about. When would the destruction of the temple take place, the destruction of Jerusalem, and when and what would be the sign of his coming and the end of the age? And as we've talked about, there's been a lot of different speculation and discussions and arguments on everything that is written here that Jesus spoke to his disciples in regard to end times. And a lot of what gives just different interpretations and uncertainty about what Jesus had spoke is that there is a near meaning of what things that he had spoken here in Matthew 24 and 25, as well as a far-off meaning. And that near and far-off meaning really intertwined throughout what Jesus speaks here, and trying to decipher, is it near, is it far, is it both, has been a point of debate and will continue to be until Jesus does return. But we need to keep the main focus and the big picture in mind, as I always want to remind you before we dig in, and that is Christ will return, and we need to be ready. And we need to be found doing the work of the kingdom, which is witnessing to the lost before he returns. And as Jesus' reply to the disciples' question moves on to the sign of his return and of the close of the age, the emphasis falls consistently throughout the remaining verses of Matthew 24 and into Matthew 25 on the preparedness of Jesus' disciples for his return. And in teaching and emphasizing our preparedness as his disciples and God's children, he uses 4 different parables to reinforce this state of preparedness and being watchful. And there is some variety, if you will, in each of these. And each parable does teach a particular point about how and why we need to be prepared. He gives the parable of the homeowner and the thief in verses 42 through 43 of chapter 24. He gives the parable of the good and the wicked servant in verses 45 through 51. And then as we move into chapter 25 to the most familiar of the parables, and that is the 10 virgins in verses 1 through 13, and then the parable of the talents in verses 14 through 30. But they all center upon the emphasis of being prepared in a state of continual readiness for his return. And it's through these parables that Jesus emphasizes that as his disciples, not only for Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the 12 who were there, but also for us, that we are to wait in a very alert state and in an attitude of expectancy of the reward that is to come when he returns. Because the unprepared and the unrepentant, to be unprepared means to be unrepentant, will receive only judgment. And that's the way that Jesus closes out this teaching of the Olivet Discourse in chapter 25 of verses 31 through 46. But again, Jesus' primary point in the verses that we're going to be looking at for the next couple of Wednesdays, tonight and Lord willing next Wednesday and possibly another Wednesday if I can't get it all in these two. His primary point in these verses is the imminence of his return. So let's read together verse 36 of Matthew 24. Jesus says, "But about the day and the hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone." Lord, open our hearts by the ministry of Holy Spirit that we may receive your truth. Even though it's scriptures that possibly we have read and we have heard taught and preached many times, Lord, may the freshness of your word, because it is living and it is powerful, through the ministry of Holy Spirit, once again pierce our hearts and our minds. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So, two words definitely stick out in verse 36. It's the word day and the word hour. And if we take a closer look at these two words, we find a few different ways that these words are used within the culture of the time. Day and hour. If we look at the word day that is translated for us from the Greek, it can roughly refer to a 24-hour period that began at sunset, and can also be used as an indication of time that can refer to either a literal day, 24-hour period, or either a period of time that is unspecified. The day of the return of the Lord. That specifies, or I should say, it talks about a period of time that is unspecified. The judgment of the Lord. Things of that nature that even we read of, and I know it's, well, in the Septuagint it would be, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, that when it talked about the prophets about the day of the judgment of God, that it spoke of that unspecified period of time that God's judgment would come. And when we look at the word hour in general refers to an undefined period of time in a day. Like we read a lot of times the 9th hour or the 6th hour. So it refers generally to an undefined period of time in a day or to a definite point of time as an occasion for an event. The hour, Jesus said to his mother, "My hour has not" what? Come. That when they were at the cousin's wedding and they had run out of drink. And Mary says, "Do whatever he says." And he says, not in a degrading, because if I'd have said woman to my mother, I'd have picked myself up off the floor. But that's not what Jesus meant. It was just specifying who she was, okay? Jesus wasn't being disrespectful. But he says, "Woman, my hour has not come." I mean, it speaks to a designated point of time or an occasion for an event. So in looking at those two words, we find in verse 36 that Jesus' direct answer to the question about the time of his coming. He now is answering that. And these two words emphasize that the precise moment of the Lord's return cannot be calculated by anyone except, as he says, the Father. The Father. And so when we read this, isn't it amazing when we read this that there is such firmness in what Jesus states here in verse 36. Wouldn't you agree with me? There's firmness in this. And the detailed prophecies that are given that we have read through about the events that would come about between his first coming and his second coming, that it has led, I guess, to natural curiosity, if you wanted to say that. To some to look for dates down through the centuries as they have, because possibly they felt that they could work out the date. But Jesus said, the day and the hour no one knows. And one would have thought that by him saying no one, it would be definite enough to make clear the impossibility of anyone of fixing an exact date or even a proximity on that date. It shuts out what Jesus says here. It literally shuts out the whole human race from the knowledge in answering the question. But notice how Jesus takes it even further, because he says even the angels, the ministering spirits of God, don't even have this knowledge of when my return will be and the end of the age will come about. Even in heaven, the knowledge is not shared. And Jesus takes it further, and it might surprise us maybe when we first read this, that the Son did not share in this secret. The only person Jesus states in verse 36 that knows is God the Father. And that's it. Now, some of us might say, well, haven't things changed? And what I mean by that, things changed since Jesus died. He rose again and has ascended to the Father. And I'm just alluding to this to just give us a deeper understanding of points of doctrine within the Scriptures. Now, there are those that do believe, in fact, our fellowship does hold to what we would call the doctrine of kenosis, which is the Greek word that means emptying. That since Jesus now has finished his work here on earth and is ascended to the Father now with all authority, everything being placed under his feet, that it's in this moment now that he does know. In fact, the doctrine of kenosis, the emptying, comes from what Paul states in Philippians 2, verses 5 through 7. Having this attitude in yourself, which also is in Christ Jesus, who, as he already existed in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but notice here in verse 7, but emptied, there's the word kenosis, emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men. That we hold, and many do hold to this doctrine of kenosis, that yes, this emptying out for him to be fully human. In fact, the doctrine of Christ being the Son of Man, that this alludes to it here in verse 36, that in this moment, in Jesus' present form as the God-man, that he himself did not know, right? Jesus doesn't lie, he's God, and he said in this moment, he didn't know, the angels didn't know. The only one that knows is the Father, because he has emptied himself out to be the perfect sacrifice, to be fully man and yet fully God, to pay the price for our redemption. But now that he has ascended to the Father with complete authority, we hold to the fact that he is in knowledge because he has ascended back to who he was in the very beginning before there was time. So just throwing that out there as a bone that if you want to chew on it, you can. And if you don't, you can throw it in the trash. Just whatever you want to do with it. But Jesus emphasizes in verse 36 the unexpectedness of his return. And now, as we come to the next few verses, he makes a comparison that we're familiar with in the time of Moses. The time that they are living in now, or the time of his return, would be like the time of Noah. Not Moses, but Noah. Up to this point, if we look, Matthew 24:25, Mark 13, Luke 21, which speak to the Olivet Discourse, up to this point, Mark's narrative has mirrored that of Matthew and Luke. But now, as we come past verse 36, Matthew includes a section that Mark does not have. He doesn't record for us. And Luke has much of the content that Matthew begins to talk about in this section, but it's in a different context. But now Jesus proceeds, Matthew tells us, to bring out what this means for those who live the life of service to God by pointing out what had happened in a critical period long ago. And that is, he states in verse 37, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be." So Jesus says there is a resemblance of the coming of the Son of Man to the coming of the flood. And we're not told how long it took Noah to build the ark, but that thing was massive. When we read about just the measurements and we understand what that ark was going to carry, it was massive. In fact, if you go, is it Kentucky or isn't it Kentucky? Where they have a replication of the ark. To just see it is just, I've only seen it through pictures, through videos. I've never been there. Maybe some of you have. Has anybody ever been there? Okay. Is it not massive? It's massive. Okay, massive. You get that, right? It's massive. It's big. So just think of it this way. He didn't have a skill saw, no table saw, no electricity. They're bare hands. They didn't even have what I have at my house that my dad gave to me when my grandfather passed away, and that's his old handsaw. They didn't even have those tools that we may have. So we can imagine how long it took Noah and his sons, his family, to build that ark. Because no one else helped him. The Bible's very clear. No one else helped him. They all thought he was crazy. Noah, what you building? I'm building a boat. Why are you building a boat for? Because it's going to rain. Rain? What's rain? It never rained. How was the water, or how was the earth watered in that time? The dew of the day. The morning. So you're crazy. So we can, in thinking about this, in the context of the illustration that Jesus is giving about the coming of the Son of Man being like the days of Noah before the flood, then it took Noah years to build that ark. But when Noah and his family and the animals entered the ark, the flood came how? Immediately. It didn't just start sprinkling and then getting a little harder. No, when we read the story in Genesis, it came immediately. It came swiftly. And so we get the picture of a long time of waiting and then of a sudden act at the conclusion of the waiting. It happened immediately. And so Jesus, referring to the life in the pre-flood days, he is alluding to the fact of the unpreparedness of the people. In the Old Testament, if we go back and we read in Genesis, the Old Testament informs us that the people of the day, why was the flood coming? I'll get some interaction so you guys feel a part. Why did the flood come? Sin. And it wasn't just sin. I mean, how does Moses emphasize? Because we hold to the tradition that Genesis was written by Moses. It says they sinned exceedingly, right? It was bad. It was bad. It had reached to heaven, if you will. And because of that, God was going to punish their sinfulness. Now, in this referring back to the pre-flood time, does Jesus ever talk about the sinfulness? No, he doesn't. He just refers back to the time. He doesn't directly refer to the general sinfulness of the people of Noah's day. But what he does specifically hone in on was how that life during the time of his return in the end of the age would be just like life during the pre-flood time. And that is, people were engaged, Jesus says, in eating and drinking. They were marrying and giving in marriage. Everyday life stuff, right? And these actions continued right up to the day Noah and his family and all of the animals entered the ark. So Jesus' point, as I drag it on out, is that the people were so wrapped up in everyday activities that they were caught off guard because they had no concern for righteousness and spiritual realities. They were just caught up in their lives and just doing lives and living in their pleasure, that when the day of God's judgment came, they were caught unprepared. And by contrast, we know from the story, Noah and his family went about with preparations for the coming flood, even though they saw no specific signs of its coming and did not know when it would arrive. They were found daily doing what God had spoken until the word was complete, and God shut them up in the ark to protect them. In the same way, what Jesus is referring to through this illustration of the pre-flood days, as it will mirror the days before his return, is that individuals will be called unaware. Those who do not heed the warning. Because we understand through Genesis that Noah actually preached to the people. But they chose not to listen. They chose not to heed the warnings that were given. And so they were spiritually unprepared. So Jesus states that there are only two categories. Two categories. Those who are prepared, the saved, the redeemed, and those who are unprepared, the lost. And then he goes down to verse 40 and 41 and talking about these two categories, the separation of individuals, the prepared and the unprepared, and he talks about it a little further through men in the field and women grinding at the mill. Verse 40, at that time there will be two men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. Two women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. So two pictures of the activities that will be going on at that time when Jesus returns. Now, if we look in the context of where Jesus is speaking, he's speaking in the first century. So this is just everyday affairs, isn't it? Guys working in the field. Ladies grinding up grain to prepare food for the day. Just normal day activities that will be going on. So it's not the emphasis of what people are doing, it's about the preparedness. That the ones who are prepared will be ready for God's return, Christ's return, and therefore they will be with Christ. But those who are not spiritually prepared will not be ready and therefore will be separated from the Lord. We understand this as we read the context, not only in Matthew, but in Mark and in Luke, and if we bring in Revelation with it. The practical conclusion that is drawn from verses 36 through 41 is that of constant readiness. I know this is not something that is new to you, and I know that you've heard this, but it still is important. We know this. And that constant state of readiness is really brought about in the parables that Jesus speaks of and that we're going to look at in the coming Wednesdays. And after stating this fact and saying that no one knows the hour, no one knows the day, not the angels, not the Son of God or the Son of Man, but only the Father, and how that individuals leading up to the return of Christ will be like in the days of Noah. He comes down to verse 42 and says, therefore, now that you understand this, I'm telling you this so you will know it plainly. Be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. And when we've heard this preached, I can remember as a little kid really hearing this preached. You know, hell's hot, heaven's not. Ever how you want to put it, you need to be ready. You need to be ready. I can remember as a little kid being scared, spitless. Am I ready? Am I ready? Come on. Y'all were there with me, weren't you? As a little kid, not fully understanding what's going on. Am I ready? And then worried because you come in the house from playing out the yard and nobody's in the house, and you go searching for them in the house, and you turn white as a sheet because the rapture's coming. I'm left behind. What am I going to do? Right? I wasn't ready to go. But Jesus says, because you understand, and I've given you this illustration, be on the alert. And what's amazing is that be on the alert is one word in the Greek. One word. It's a verb in the Greek. And it means to stay awake and to keep watch. And Jesus uses this verb to emphasize for his followers to live such lives that whenever he comes, they will be prepared. And it is in the present tense, which is important because it conveys the meaning that as disciples of Christ, followers of Christ, as children of God, there should never be a time in our life that we are not watching. We are not looking. We are not waiting expectantly for his return. And that's not just that we will be prepared, but we know he's coming. And not only we prepare, but we're trying to get as many people who will listen to us to be prepared. Therefore, verse 42 begins with, it links the demand to the uncertainty. The demand is what? Be on the alert. Stay awake. Keep watch continually. Therefore, links the demand to the uncertainty that attaches to the time of the coming. There is uncertainty, not that he's going to come back, but when he's going to come back. So may we not be uncertain about his return. We're just uncertain about when it's going to take place. So therefore, since you don't know, be ready. Be ready. If people knew, and you've heard this taught as well, you've heard this preached, if people knew exactly when the coming would take place, they would delay preparations until just before that time, right? It's like when your mom or daddy told you, I want your room cleaned before I get back. Now we've got phones that you can have Life 360 and you can see where your parents are, right? And so if you had that device and your mom and daddy, I want it now. When I walk out of this house, I want you to clean. In fact, no, I want you to start cleaning it now. And you go in there and you're cleaning it all, and they leave and you kind of look and they're on down the road and you get your phone out and you just kind of leave it there and you just go to whatever you want to do. And you just keep watch and you just keep watch to it and keep watch to it. Okay, they're coming back now. Okay, now I need to get it clean. Well, that's the whole concept. If people knew just exactly when the coming would take place, they would delay preparation until right before the time, if you wanted to say it that way. But we don't know. And therefore, we must live in a constant state of readiness. Ignorance of the day, when it's going to happen, is one of the conditions of living here now, is we're ignorant of it. We don't know. We don't know. We know it's going to happen. We just don't know when. As we close out tonight, I want to look at Luke. And Luke's reference that we find in verse 34, 35, and 36. And Luke records for us two commands given by Jesus regarding our state of readiness for his return. The first command we find in verses 34 and 35. And that command is to be on guard, avoiding behavior that denies his return. The way we live either speaks to our belief of his return or our unbelief of his return. If I believe he's returning someday, then I'm going to live like it. Be on guard, Luke 21:34, so that your hearts will not be weighed down with dispensation and drunkenness and the worries of life. And that day will come upon you suddenly like a trap, like it did in the day of Noah. For it will come upon all those who dwell on the face of the earth. So be on guard. Avoid behavior that denies his return. That's the first command. And the second command toward a state of readiness as his children is keep on the alert, anticipating the one who will indeed return. Look at verse 36. Jesus says, but keep on the alert at all times, praying that you may have strength to escape all these things that are about to take place and to stand before the Son of Man. So when we look at these two commands for a continual state of readiness for His return, the first one is to remain alert, to make sure that our behavior doesn't deny His return, but it affirms His return. And the question is, we need to take a look. Take a look at our lives. Review the things that we spend our time and resources on. Do the things I spend my time and my resources, I'm not saying we can't enjoy this life. God has definitely given us the means to do that. But does the core of my life and my being really reflect to the fact that He's coming back? Does my priorities deny that He is my King and that He will reign? Or do my actions suggest that I'm living in denial of that literal return? Because Jesus says, be on guard and avoid behavior that denies my return. And then the second command that He gives is that we anticipate the one who will indeed return. And this describes faithfulness in daily living that glorifies God. As we examine our lives, do we feel affirmed or apologetic if the Lord were to ask for an account of our work? Would I be able to affirm, yes, Lord, I've had my hand to the plow and I haven't looked back, and I'm busy as the parable of the talent, the man that received, or the one that received 5 to the one that received 2. And I'm not apologetic as the one who received just 1, but I'm steadily working because I know He's coming back soon. That's the point as we close tonight. That's the point. And I just pray as we've been looking for these past few weeks that I haven't bored you to tears, but that God, that I've just stirred your heart and your mind to action. Because that's what the study of end times is all about. Stirring our hearts and our minds toward action. Action for the kingdom. In the way that I live, the things that I do, and the way that I witness of His soon return. And it encourages me because I know the sufferings and the things that I face here in this life, that one day they will come to an end and I have eternity to spend with the Lord. Would I rather have pleasure here that is temporal, or would I rather live in eternal pleasure that can't even fully be described to me now because I walk in obedience with Him? Father, I just pray, Lord, as we've just continued to look to Your Word and to reflect upon the certainty of Your return in these past few weeks, Father, my prayer is that our hearts and our minds would be stirred toward Your loving presence. That, Lord, You are present with us here, that the trials and the things that we walk through in this life, You are present with us. And, Lord, that we are, as we talked about this past Sunday, that we groan with creation, our groaning in the suffering and the things that we walk through in this life, but our groanings cannot begin. Our suffering cannot begin to compare with the glory that is to be revealed to us and through us as we see You as You are and we become like You in Your nature. It can't even begin to compare with what is in store for those who are faithful. Lord, I pray, stir our hearts, stir our minds. Oh God, that we would keep our eyes steadfast upon You, and we would remain in a state of preparedness, a state of watchfulness, not just in the way that we live and what we give our lives to, but also being a witness. Oh God, stir us.